Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, May 6th, and we are going to be diving into the NBA playoff action from this past weekend. We're going to start off by talking about the Cleveland Cavaliers Game 7 win against the Orlando Magic on Sunday afternoon. And we're going to bounce around a little bit from the weekend of the past, talking about the Dallas Mavericks knocking out the LA Clippers from their game on Friday night, and the Minnesota Timberwolves stealing Game 1 against the Denver Nuggets in what should be an absolutely fantastic series. And finally, we're going to be ending off the show by talking about the updated second round matchups that we hadn't talked about yet. On Friday, we talked about the matchups between the Knicks and Pacers and the Timberwolves versus the Nuggets. Now we are going to be talking about some of the updated matchups that we have. The Celtics playing the Cavaliers and the Thunder playing the Mavericks, so don't miss the preview for that series. But before we get into the show, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Anything would be greatly appreciated. Help us grow this channel, and if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Now, we're going to be starting off today talking about yesterday's game between the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Orlando Magic, which saw the Cavs take Game 7, pull off the biggest Game 7 comeback in NBA history, and secure their spot in the second round. So we left the show off on Friday talking about the fact that the Cavaliers had a 3-2 series lead. They had a chance to close it out that night against the Orlando Magic. And despite Donovan Mitchell dropping 50 points in the game, they end up losing that one because the rest of the team just did not show up at all from an offensive perspective. Mitchell, as a part of his 50 points, scored all 18 Cavaliers baskets, or points I should say, in the fourth quarter of that game. Not just that, he went unassisted on every single one of those points. So really it was just him versus the rest, and you were sort of looking at it, Marcus Morris was in that closing group for Cleveland, and this is a team, not to take a shot at Marcus Morris necessarily, but when this is, a team that invested as much as they did into this core, they are expecting to, be in the realm of championship contention, and it just doesn't really seem that way. Now, they were, of course, shorthanded. They didn't have Jarrett Allen for the last 3 games of this series, which did play a role in some of this potentially, but also, on the flip side, could have played a role in some of the production we've seen from Evan Mobley as well. We'll dive into that later in this segment here, but they end up losing on Friday, and then fast forward to Sunday afternoon, the Cavaliers are halfway through the second quarter, have scored just 25 points, trailed by 18, and it looked like things may have been over for them at that point, but they were able to overcome it despite getting booed from their home crowd at that point. It looked really bleak, but Donovan Mitchell, he had struggled early in that game. He got himself going and was the spark plug both from the production himself, but also you saw some of the leadership qualities of Mitchell that were really, they were really positive to see, because Mitchell is a player that, it seems like this year at least he was a little bit forgotten about because of all the injuries. He wasn't eligible for any All-NBA awards or such. So, Mitchell is a player that has been a postseason performer really since he first entered the league, and yesterday he showed sort of a side of himself that has shown the grown maturity with him since he first entered the league. What he was doing with Darius Garland was really cool to see. The fact that Garland was really struggling in this game. He missed 10 of his first 11 shots, and Mitchell was on the sideline with him, talking him through it, saying, hey, I'm going to need you in this game. And eventually he ends up getting it back to Garland. Garland had missed an open three look, but Okoro kept the ball alive. Mitchell got it back to him. Garland hits the three. Magic call timeout, and Donovan Mitchell runs over to him, gives him a big hug, and it was, this sort of wholesome moment. And, at that point, the Cavaliers had sort of pulled away. The third quarter is really where they did their damage. Max Strus sort of showed some of his Miami side. He got hot from three. And again, Mitchell was just continuously in this game, digging and getting to the rim. And some of his finishes and just his touch in the paint is so fun to watch from a shorter player. And he ends up scoring 89 points combined between Game 6 and Game 7. That is second most all-time in a Game 6, Game 7 combined standpoint. Only Allen Iverson did better. He had 90 in his run earlier in the early 2000s. So Mitchell deserves so much credit for the way that the Cavaliers were able to come out of this on top. And I guess what I'll say, because as much as it is a positive thing, you love to see this, it was a really entertaining series in my eyes. I know that the offensive execution wasn't necessarily at the highest level, but it was sort of refreshing to see. It wasn't just bad offense, it was legitimately good defenses. We know how good Orlando has been. That's been their calling card all year, and we'll get to them shortly as well. The Cavaliers are another defense, though, that sort of gets a little bit swept under the rug, but they are also very impressive themselves, and that sort of paired with the offensive side of the Magic picture. Again, we'll dive into that. But the franchise of the Cleveland Cavaliers wins their first playoff series without LeBron James since 1993. Like I mentioned, 18 points was the largest Game 7 comeback in NBA history. Now, it doesn't fully absolve them of the questions surrounding their future, because it was clear throughout this series, as entertaining as it was, both of these teams have some real flaws, and neither of them really looked like championship contenders in this. For the Magic, it's sort of okay because this was the sort of overachieving year, and they weren't necessarily they were maybe supposed to be a play-in tournament team, but they end up grabbing the 6th seed. They had a great regular season. We saw the jumps with Paolo Banchero, and he was tremendous in this series. He was really the one on the other side that had just about all of it going for this Orlando Magic team, because in that Game 7 close-up matchup, there just wasn't another player sort of alongside him. You had Franz Wagner, 1 of 15 from the field, and Jalen Suggs, 2 of 13. So the other Magic players really struggled in this one. And, you could just see Paolo at the end. They did a sort of a close zoom in on him, and he was just absolutely beat. He got himself to the free throw line. It was 18 times. He shot 28 shots in general. And, especially in that first half is really when he was doing his digging. But it just seemed like, he is definitely going to need help, and the Magic have such a solid foundation around this core. Now, Franz needs to be a better 2, and maybe it comes with the fact that the rest of the spacing surrounding him and Paolo isn't necessarily there yet, but he became a total non-factor in terms of spacing it himself. Shot something below 20%, I believe it was, after the All-Star break, and he is a very promising player, but for somebody where I've seen, a handful of probably Magic fans talking about the fact that if you were to redraft that 2021 class, Franz would be in contention for the first overall pick. We're going to need to see some more development from him. I thought that ultimately as a whole, this was a little bit of a disappointing year from him from an efficiency standpoint. Now, I will see. There are ups and downs in the first few years. I'm definitely not selling all of my stock on him. I think that he's going to eventually be a better version of what he was during the series. He's still just 22 years old, but definitely some red flags there. How is he going to fit in with Paolo Banchero? They try and work a little bit of that two-man game, I thought, as this series went on, which would be interesting to see if they can do so. The issue is, it seems like Franz sort of needs the ball to do his downhill scoring, And that's why I liked Paolo as the screener in some of these instances. But the reality is you want Paolo to be the one with the ball in his hands, and it's not bad if he learns to play off ball as well. But I would, prefer Franz to actually be able to sort of create some stuff more on his own, at least have the opposing defense respect the shot, and that just wasn't really the case in this game. But that was sort of a tangent on the Magic. Again, I've said this multiple times throughout their playoff series here. I'm buying into the Magic long term, but this was just never going to be their year, and that's fully okay. We saw the Timberwolves sort of last year. I wouldn't say they overachieved necessarily. They were an 8 seed, granted in a competitive Western Conference, and they, it was interesting with them because as much as there was the extracurricular drama that was going on with them, they at least had that postseason experience. And now we've seen, we're going to get to Anthony Edwards and that team later in the show today, but it is just an example of just getting your foot in the door is the best way to start to build up this experience and that mentality and understanding sort of what it takes to succeed in the postseason. And the Magic made that first step in my eyes. But sort of shifting gears here back to the Cavaliers, like I said, this is a series where at least they come out of it. The level of panic would have been much higher if they did end up losing this series to the Magic. They were favorites. They had home court advantage. We saw home team won every single game in this series. So at least, for them, they can put off some of these questions surrounding them, and I definitely don't want to, dump all over the Cavaliers as soon as they win this first round matchup. But at the same time, I do feel like there are going to be questions. We saw Mobley be a little bit more comfortable, he was definitely more involved offensively, not that his scoring output was necessarily tremendous during this series, but I also don't know how much of a creator Jarrett Allen is himself, and I think that he is a player that every single team could benefit from. But in terms of the growth of Evan Mobley, is that pairing in the front court going to be good enough? Especially then you start to take into consideration some of the spacing issues that exist. I know Mobley's been working on his shot from the perimeter more as of late. Maybe that would be the sort of difference to end up having this double big lineup be more impactful. But up to this point, I don't know if Mobley and Allen can both be the best versions of themselves when they're playing next to one another. And you can sort of say the same when it comes to Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell. Mitchell is definitely wouldn't consider him a point guard, but he is a little bit more of a combo guard than just a pure two. And we see he is able to take over these moments, and the way that he's able to attack downhill and, create for himself is so massively important. And he becomes more of an on-the-ball guy. It seems like the team sort of has to run through him in order for him to get his points. I don't know if he's necessarily developed his game enough to play as much off-ball. Now, again, he's easily an all-NBA caliber player. I love watching Donovan Mitchell. I'm just saying in terms of, again, this conversation as to is the fit right with things, how things currently stand in Cleveland, I'm not sure about that. We saw Garland, again, Game 7 really struggled, so I don't want to get caught up necessarily in the recency bias of all of this, but I've been saying this for a bit now that I just don't know necessarily about how this is fully going to work. They feel a little bit redundant to me from an offensive standpoint with both of their small guards and both of their bigs that, it's just a conversation that is going to be had one way or another. People were already, I'm sure, firing up the trade machine in terms of where's Donovan Mitchell going to go. We've had tons of rumors about him potentially wanting out of Cleveland after this season. He's under contract for the 2024-25 season, and then he is a free agent, or has a player option after that he is likely going to decline, become a free agent, and could potentially walk from Cleveland. So Again, these are conversations that I don't want to dive too much into right now because we're talking about them winning right now. But this upcoming series that they're going to have against the Celtics, which we're going to be fully previewing in our final segment of the day, it just feels like there is a lot of weight on that, because how much better is losing to the Celtics in 5 than it is losing to the Magic in the first round? And obviously it's a different conversation because of the fact that they aren't expected to win against the Celtics. We'll get into the odds later. They are very, very much underdogs in this upcoming series against the Celtics, so it's not like they're expected to win. But that is the thing about this conversation is, what are you building to? What is going to get better in the upcoming years? And a couple weeks ago, I talked about this idea of, well, what's different from last year's Cavaliers to this year's Cavaliers? And there's obviously the natural development from some of the younger players. Evan Mobley, I feel like specifically, has been the one that has sort of stepped up the most. But Garland, it just doesn't seem like, his numbers are going down, and obviously numbers aren't everything. And I feel like a lot of basketball fans can get sort of wrapped up in that. But I don't know if his player progression path, he was just an all-star player a couple years ago, and his numbers definitely dropped during the regular season and during the playoffs as well. This first round series, at least, he only averaged 15 points per game, which was lower than his season average of 18 points per game. He has seen his numbers dip in each of the past 3 seasons. So, I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to necessarily be down on the Cavaliers after just winning this series, but it does feel like this is a team that is going to be in for a move this offseason. Now, again, we'll see how this pans out with their series against the Celtics. We're going to end this segment here because I have more thoughts on that Celtics-Cavaliers matchup that I want to hit later in the show, but we have some other things to get to first. So we're going to be taking our first break, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the Mavericks beating the Clippers that took place on Friday night. Another disappointing early exit for the Clippers. So we will be touching on that right after the break. Stick with us. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just wrapped up talking about the Cleveland Cavaliers defeating the Orlando Magic in Game 7, pulling off that comeback. But now we are going to be moving on to the Western Conference, where we had a couple big games from the weekend. We're going to be starting with the Los Angeles Clippers falling to the Dallas Mavericks in their Game 6 matchup and officially being eliminated from the postseason, which sort of leads to all different types of questions surrounding this team. I guess we'll just sort of start on the Mavericks side of this briefly, because it was really encouraging to see for the Mavericks the way that this relationship between Luka and Kyrie has just continued to develop, and the fact that it seems like Kyrie has sort of put the doubts surrounding his level of buy-in and his level of maturity in terms of being regularly available for a team sort of put that to rest. And listen, I know it's super easy to go and play revisionist history. He was a distraction, at least of sorts, when he was in Brooklyn, and it didn't seem like, even when you go back to Boston a little bit as well, there was just sort of a, I don't want to call it selfishness, but that is kind of what it was. And it was just sort of something that was really frustrating because Kyrie Irving, the basketball player, is just so fun to watch. And now it feels like he is on this other side of his sort of need to be a little bit of the center of attention and to have things circulate around him. And he plays with a player in Luka who they kind of share a lot of similarities in their game, but they do so in such a complementary way of one another. And we see Kyrie, I mean, I think one of the biggest things, he's clearly, when he's speaking in these interviews, he's making a point of it himself, which is fair, but how much more he cares about the defensive end nowadays, understanding that there is another player on his team that can really do it all offensively. And we've seen him, just the hustle plays that he made over the course of this series was tremendous. I bring this all up because in the second half of this game, where Kyrie was a little bit quieter in the first half because he is sort of okay with deferring to Luka a little bit more. And I say that, I feel like a lot of the times when you get in basketball media, this idea of deferring is such a, has a negative connotation, but I think it's unselfish. It plays into a team game, and when you have a teammate like Luka Doncic, it is absolutely fair to do so. But in this game, Luka yet again really struggled from the field. He was 9 of 26. The three-point shooting for him has just been brutal in this first round series. So he ends up averaging 30 points per game in the series. So it's hard to necessarily criticize Luka, but his three-point shooting percentage was just under 24% on 11 attempts per game. And it is really hurting him, and you can argue the team as well, even though especially down the stretch of that series, the Mavericks were sort of cruising. But, Kyrie saw that the shot wasn't necessarily there for Luka. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation about how healthy is that knee that he has been dealing with the injury, and Kyrie just sort of took things into his own hand, had LeBron tweeting about him. Definitely LeBron maybe trying to play a little bit of this recruiter for the offseason ahead, but Mavericks end up winning this one 114-101, and it was in large part due to Kyrie's 30-point performance. So we are going to be talking more on the Mavericks as the series goes on, sort of a big underlying storyline that doesn't necessarily receive the national media attention, but the fact that Maxi Kleber went down with an injury early in this game and could be out for the remainder of the playoffs. It was a separated shoulder. He's being listed out indefinitely, but Kleber was such a huge part of the Mavericks. Now, I will say, I think to some degree, Kleber was a really impactful player for that matchup in particular, where they could run the double big lineups and the Clippers couldn't necessarily hurt them from a spacing perspective because of the Russell Westbrook minutes, who, Russ, I touched on it before. I don't want to get too much into it again, but it's just gone in such a sad direction for Westbrook. Only plays 9 minutes in this game. They basically went with a 6-man rotation for the most part. The only player in double-digit minutes off of the bench in this game for the Clippers was Norman Powell. You knew the Clippers were desperate anyways as soon as you saw PJ Tucker in that starting lineup, but that's sort of besides the point. But Maxi Kleba was very impactful for them, the ability to space out and just provide some different looks. What I talked about before with the Mavericks that I really like is the variety of different lineups they can throw out there. Their bigs, they have a rotation of different guys. You can run Kleba at the 5, but in this series they were putting him a lot at the 4 alongside Gafford or Lively, who would, play those real traditional center minutes. So I liked that, along with the flexibility they have at the 3 position as well. But this could definitely be a big loss, playing an OKC team that can absolutely put up points. And again, I don't want to dive too much into that series just yet. We have the preview coming up later on this show, but that is something to definitely take into consideration when you look at whether or not the Mavericks are going to be able to, roll out the same exact team, because it doesn't seem like that is going to be the case. They're already dealing with the Tim Hardaway Jr. injury as well. So definitely a great feeling for the Mavericks. Definitely not counting them out, but at the same time, some injuries building up for them in an unfortunate way. But they are able to take down the Clippers in this series, and now the Clippers head into this offseason with tons of questions. It really makes you look back on that contract extension that they decided to hand out to Kawhi Leonard over during the middle of the season, because Kawhi was playing a tremendous year, but just time after time again, and it's unfortunate because Kawhi has been one of my favorite players to watch throughout the course of me watching basketball games. But you go and you look at the way that he has been able to be available on the court, and it just has not been there. Where the fact you look at, he has played in just 8 games in the past, I don't know, I'm trying to do math off the top of my head, but since the start of the 2021 playoffs, he missed 4 out of 4. He played the first 4 games against Utah, missed the final 2, and then the entire game 7 game series against the Suns. He played the first 2 against the Suns last year, then missed the final 3. And now he plays in just 2 of 5, was clearly compromised when he was on the court for the Mavericks as well. So this is just a situation for LA where, they're moving into this new arena, which is, from a business perspective, a big deal. And it leads to the fact that they feel like they need to invest into this star talent. They are the little brother of LA, so they're trying to, make a name for themselves, but they're doing so with an undeniable Hall of Fame talent in Kawhi Leonard, but just his availability has been abysmal for them the past handful of years, and now they enter an offseason where James Harden is a massive question, what you want to do with him, because he was another player that when it seemed like they had all of these different options and that they had depth, it was one of those conversations, well, yeah, with Harden in the postseason, you know that you're not going to get an elite level of play on a nightly basis, but if he's your third option, you can sort of get away with it. And then very quickly, he was catapulted up to being the second option, having the ball in his hands that much more. And ultimately, his stats weren't terrible, 21 points per game, 45-38 shooting splits. But down the stretch of this series as well, he was just sort of unable to. And when, all of that pressure was on him, Kawhi was ruled out. The Clippers had, they were up against the wall. He just wasn't able to pull them out of it. And that wasn't what the expectation of trading for a, however old he is now, 34-year-old James Harden. It wasn't the idea that he was going to have to be the number one option, but we also got a very inconsistent Paul George playoff series. Now we're going to have to see how this sort of plays out in terms of whether or not the Clippers are going to want to pay him, and sort of try and run this back again. I still feel like in a world without injuries, if you are playing NBA 2K and you turn off injuries, the Clippers are a championship caliber roster for sure. But I still think things would have been very difficult for them as the playoffs went on. If they were to have to play the Nuggets, I just don't really see a world where they were ever overcoming that. We see what the Timberwolves are doing in the playoffs, and the way that the Timberwolves sort of were a bad matchup for the Clippers during the regular season anyways. Again, we know how little the regular season actually means in terms of postseason results in the NBA, but it's just a very interesting conversation. You have all of these players who have massive red flags surrounding them in James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and, you know, if you want to get into the bench as well, Russell Westbrook, PJ Tucker. Like, on paper, it looks like they have depth, and the fact that they had to shrink down their rotation so much was something that was almost a little bit concerning. You know, I like Amir Coffey, the fact that they didn't, you know, but he also doesn't provide that much offensively, so I can't understand it. But I like Coffey too, so the fact that they only decided to roll him out for 8 or so minutes in this game was not, you know, didn't love it. There's an interesting Ty Lue conversation as well. I feel like if you're the Clippers, you want to bring him back. But at the same time, the Lakers are sort of knocking on the door, trying to get Ty Lue to switch over to the other side of LA. And the Clippers are going to need to make a change. But at the same time, are they going to actually make that change in their first year in LA, where they are going to try and make this whole investment into getting their own arena and building themselves up as a brand that sort of stands out in comparison to the Lakers as well? Still just a massive question, and going to be really interesting to see how they decide to play this all out. I'm not really sure what other options they have is the reality, other than, you know, they traded off some of the bench pieces in order to get James Harden, so I don't think they gave up any real pieces, at least, but probably let him walk. I don't think that anybody really, I mean, somebody is going to pay James Harden is the reality of the situation. I don't know if a team that is a true championship hopeful is going to have the money or is going to want to spend the money on James Harden, and he absolutely wants a contract for himself. So I guess we will see how this all plays out. But let me know in the comment section what you guys think the Clippers should do in this offseason. We are going to be taking our second break now, and when we come back on the other end, I want to dive into the Timberwolves taking game 1 from the Nuggets in Denver and the continued ascension of Anthony Edwards. So we are going to be taking a quick break. We will be right back. Stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Moving on now to the matchup on Saturday night between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Denver Nuggets, in which we saw the Timberwolves take game 1 and potentially shift the outcome of this series. If you look on DraftKings Sportsbook, it flipped the odds that now in favor of the Timberwolves. They are minus 125 to win the series as things currently stand as we record this. But definitely a standout performance in a handful of different ways. There was we'll start with Anthony Edwards, of course. He was the story of the game, especially coming out in the first half, and he was just unstoppable. He ends up scoring 43 points in this game, and it is interesting to sort of see, you get all of these different comparisons to Michael Jordan, to Kobe Bryant. Our boss here at the GSMC Sports Network, Andrew Tate, earlier we were talking about it, and he referred to him as a happy Kobe Bryant because he does have the play style, some of the demeanors of these players that draw the similarities, but the difference is he sort of does it he's still talking trash the entire game, and he wants to sort of put you on this, he wants to put you on the wrong end of a SportsCenter top 10 play every single second he's on the court, but he does so with a smile the entire time. And from he's still young, obviously, and we'll see how this sort of matures. He obviously has, parts in his game that he is going to be refining over time as well, but the fact that I talked about it on the show last week, the press conference that he had with Karl Anthony Towns, where he was sort of getting into him a little bit about picking up these stupid fouls, which has been a well-documented issue with Karl Anthony Towns, but he did so in a public setting, which typically isn't the type of move that is, that's a move that's typically frowned upon, but the fact that Edwards did it, he did it in an uplifting way, talking about the importance of Karl Anthony Towns on the team. This is why we need you to stop fouling. Now, stop effing fouling. And he was doing it with a smile on his face the whole time. So, I don't know. I guess a little bit of a body language and demeanor expert over here. I think I am, but it is, it's really encouraging to see his leadership style and the way that this entire Timberwolves team has bought into what he's selling. And now, again, we're having all these conversations about how great he is, and it is definitely justified. Do I think that there's a chance we could be going a little bit to the extreme already? Possibly, but at the same time, don't want to take away from the awesome experience we have right now of watching Edwards, and it was another instance of going up. It was another instance of him showing himself, and he did so by going into the arena of the defending champs, in a lot of people's eyes, the best team in the NBA, and dropping 40 plus on their head. And, it was just interesting to see on the other end where we look at Kentavious Caldwell-Pope as this, borderline elite perimeter defender, at least if you're sort of tuned into the NBA like that. He has been a tremendous perimeter defender, and Pope just had nothing really for him. Two Georgia guys going at one another, and this is another instance of Edwards has talked about his relationship with KCP, how he views him as an older brother, but he's not going to hold anything back this series, and that was definitely made clear from game one. So I'm not really sure what the defensive adjustment for the Nuggets is. Now, when you're looking at Edwards here, especially when he is sort of feeling himself from the three-point line, which he has been in these past couple games, then there's really not much you can do. In terms of, generally speaking, though, I'm not really sure what other looks. Now, it's going to have to be probably a Mike Malone scheme thing, because I don't know if there's any other player that they can just sort of stick on Edwards and have that be the answer. Now, Michael Porter Jr. is longer. He can sort of ramp up his defense when he needs to, but he's never been necessarily a shutdown perimeter guy. He is more so known for the offensive side of his game. Now, maybe that does sort of come out, and we see MPJ play at this level we haven't before, out of a level of desperation, but it is definitely going to be interesting to see how Mike Malone tries to counter this whole Edwards experiment. But other notes from the game, seemed like Jokic was at a level of discomfort that we typically don't see, and that's why Rudy Gobert I still sort of go back and forth. I officially chose Wembanyama as my Defensive Player of the Year when we did our awards show here at the GSMC Sports Network. But, Rudy Gobert, if you vote in that direction, I thought it was the most, 50-50 call, and at least in recent history. And he continues to show how great he is. And Jokic still put up 32 points in this game. So, even when you're looking at a mediocre Jokic game, you're still looking at unbelievable stats. But he was having to settle out on the perimeter far more often than he prefers to. Setting up in the half court was a lot more difficult, so we saw the Nuggets try and push the pace maybe a little bit more than they prefer to. And when you're dealing with a Jamal Murray, who there is still definitely a question as to how healthy is he when he's dealing with that calf injury he was at the end of the Lakers series, that makes things tougher because Jokic can push himself, but that's not necessarily his game. He's more on the facilitation end, and when he needs to, he can do it himself, but especially when he's sort of, getting as physical as he is in the paint with a defender to the caliber of Rudy Gobert, it becomes much more difficult, and they're going to need the others around him to sort of take on more of a load, and just that bench continues to be a little bit of a concern for the Nuggets. I've talked about it on the show. I know that the Peyton Watson minutes and Christian Brown minutes, they do, look good in stretches, and I thought that especially when the Nuggets were making that push in the first half, that Reggie Jackson looked pretty solid, but it still doesn't feel like they have that impact guy, which sort of leads me back to the Timberwolves side of this, where I have to talk about Naz Reid because he went absolutely ballistic in the fourth quarter. It was 13 plus. He was just killing the Nuggets on the offensive end, and it was, really encouraging to see for them. It was an interesting conversation as to, do you even bring Towns back in when Naz Reid is doing what he is? Can't really run the triple big option, and Gobert, obviously, you need him to guard against Nikola Jokic, but that was such a huge plus for them to be able to help close out this game. Shows why, I didn't have him as sixth man of the year, but it's sort of hard to deny how incredible he is, and definitely was deserving of that award. But not just that, also Nickeil Alexander-Walker, I thought, maybe not necessarily in this game, but he's another sort of option that can come off of the bench that I think can be really impactful, more so than anybody on the Denver bench. And those non-Jokic minutes are typically where we see the Nuggets struggle, but even with some of the Jokic on the court minutes, the Timberwolves are just a defense that is constructed so well for helping to guard Jokic that things are going to get potentially a little bit dicey here. So as I mentioned, the Timberwolves, when you look on DraftKings, are now favored in this instance. I picked the Nuggets coming into the series. I'm not going to move off of that just because of game one, but on Friday when I laid out the way that the Timberwolves can sort of upset the Nuggets in this series, they played exactly to that way in this game. Doesn't really give anything for Jokic. Very good one-on-one defenders. Have the post presence with not just Gobert, but even having that second big that makes that sort of cheat code play of Aaron Gordon coming down the baseline and just sneaking behind the opposing defense, getting himself easy looks at the rim. That wasn't necessarily happening when that doesn't happen. It is not like Gordon is the most effective offensive player in the league because he can't really space it out for them. So I guess just, I can't move off of the Nuggets just yet, but if you were a believer in the Timberwolves for this series, that was the exact type of performance that you were sort of expecting as to why they would win. And I don't expect the Nuggets to definitely go down without a fight. So going to be interesting to see, but especially if Jamal Murray is compromised, this is going to be a massive task. And if the Timberwolves end up winning this series, there is going to be tons. I mean, there already is a ton of love for Anthony Edwards, but this whole idea of, we've known for some time, I know that today on national TV, you're going to have tons of people who are just spewing about Anthony Edwards that maybe weren't as in tune with him, weren't following him quite as much during the past, I'd call it 2 seasons, because I really think he was coming into his own last year, headed into, you know, he like could have been on the brink of making an All-NBA team, but the Timberwolves weren't winning quite as much. He gets his first All-Star appearance though, and it was clear that he was coming. The off-season stuff with Team USA and the fact that he absolutely took over that team during the past summer, and now here he is. He's going to be on an All-NBA team, first time of his career, and it's one of those situations where he's still very young. He's still, I believe, 22 years old, that you sort of think, okay, well, he's coming soon. He might already be arrived, and there's a chance that he is just so good that he's able to help elevate the Timberwolves over the Nuggets just off of his pure level of stardom that is maybe, you know, past what most people expected. And now, again, I know that there are going to be people that are sort of on the other side of the spectrum on this, because we are in such an overreaction culture here, and because a lot of people probably feel like they have to compensate a little bit for the fact that they weren't talking enough about Anthony Edwards headed into this type of a playoff series. But to go into the reigning national champs home arena and put on that type of performance, this might just be a statement that there's no more he's on his way. He may already be here for the time to be. I feel like selfishly here, quickly from a Celtics fan perspective, I would love to see him and Jason Tatum face off against one another in the finals. But, you know, that is still definitely TBD. But we are going to, on the note of the Celtics, get into their second round preview against the Cleveland Cavaliers, as well as the other matchup in the Western Conference playoffs between the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Dallas Mavericks, and I'm going to give my thoughts on those. So stick with us. We will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, and we are going to be giving some predictions for the upcoming series in the second round. We already talked about the Knicks, Pacers, Nuggets, Timberwolves series on Friday, but we finally have an updated playoff picture with the games from this past weekend, so we're going to be diving into Celtics, Cavaliers, and Thunder Magic. Starting in the Eastern Conference with Boston and Cleveland, Celtics are massive favorites in this series. According to DraftKings, they are minus 1,200, and the Cavs are plus 800. The keys, especially for Cleveland, if they do want to make this a series, is can the others outside of Donovan Mitchell step up offensively? And we know that how great Donovan Mitchell closed out that series against the Magic. The Celtics, though, do have a ton of different options to throw at Donovan Mitchell if he is going to be the one-man army, where they have the pair of, you know, potential All-NBA defensive candidates in Derek White and Drew Holiday, both in the backcourt, they can put length on him as well if they want to go with a Jaylen Brown or a Jason Tatum. Even I think some of their bench options, call me crazy, Sam Hauser is a decent defender that I definitely wouldn't want him to be the number one option for guarding Donovan Mitchell, but I just feel like they can throw a whole bunch of different looks at Mitchell, and can the others sort of step up to the plate and actually give them some real consistent production, because consistency hasn't necessarily been the number one thing for the Cavs really all season. Jarrett Allen, it's going to be interesting whether or not he's able to play, because he does feel like he's one of the more consistent players on that Cleveland roster, but dealt with the rib injury to finish off the final few games of that series against Orlando. We saw Darius Garland, we talked about this earlier in the show, averaged just 15 points and 5 assists, both numbers down, of course, from the regular season. And, Garland, he was dealing with, I think it was a jaw injury during the course of the regular season. He missed all that time when Mitchell actually helped catapult the Cavs to that massive run there in, January, February, somewhere around that time, mid-season. And was dealing with that, plus the fact that I do feel like Mitchell, in order to fully get himself going, does need to be slightly more ball dominant, and he's been incredible in the postseason, so you can't necessarily take the ball away from him in these instances, but at the same time, they need other players to be able to make an impact, and even if that is with Mitchell with the ball, what other types of looks can JB Bickerstaff and this Cleveland group throw out in order to create some better looks moving without the ball, where that hasn't necessarily been the strong suit of Darius Garland or Donovan Mitchell through the first parts of their career. And I feel like for Bickerstaff, he had to win that Magic series in order to keep his job. I feel like if they are competitive against the Celtics in this series, he'll hang on, but there is definitely a chance. I mean, I think that the most likely situation is the Cavs end up making some type of a move this offseason. I don't feel like they think that they can just run it back fully. And I guess I'll finish out here with the preview before I dive into that. One of the other keys, though, sort of on the note of Jarrett Allen, is the fact that they need to take advantage of the fact that the Celtics are without Kristaps Porzingis right now. Not sure when Allen is going to return, and this Celtics team is inherently pretty tall, but they lose a lot of that top end height with Porzingis out of the game. They're going to be starting a 37-year-old Al Horford in his place, who was solid against the Heat, but at the same time, the Heat didn't necessarily have the size either to try and make the Celtics pay, and feel like one of the areas that the Celtics have been most vulnerable this season is on the glass at times, and the Cavaliers, in theory, should definitely be a great rebounding team and have the potential to do so against the Celtics. Can you get second chance points? Can you out-physical the Celtics? Now, it's going to be interesting once Allen does come back, as we've seen this sort of dynamic between him and Evan Mobley hasn't been the prettiest from an offensive perspective. Are they going to sort of balance the minutes they actually play together? Where is that spacing going to come from? They need Strus absolutely to step up in this type of a series, but who else are going to be the players that can actually contribute? Because, the Celtics can play both offense and defense. It seems like if this is going to be the case, they can't necessarily just run I don't think the Cavaliers can bank on I don't want to call it incompetency, but call it at least the lackluster set of players on the other end from an offensive perspective, at least if you want to talk about the Orlando Magic and sort of winning out in some of these ugly games. I don't think that that's what this series is necessarily going to be, and they're going to need some of these other players to step up for them. Again, I called him out, I guess, a little bit. I wasn't trying to call him out like that, but Marcus Morris was playing closing minutes for them. So, and this was in Game 6. So, the Bickerstaff and this Cavs team is definitely still trying to work itself out in a lot of ways. And I guess we'll just see how they are able to put it together. But I do think the Celtics win this series. I don't think it's going to be, ultra competitive. As a Celtics fan, admittedly, I was actually hoping that the Cavaliers would be the Celtics matchup. I feel like the Magic at least sort of have an identity, and the Celtics should beat either one of these teams, and the Porzingis being out factor does sort of play into this, which makes me maybe a little bit more nervous, but at the same time, I just feel like the Magic would have been a very bruising team that would have been a tough second round out for the Celtics in terms of sort of, putting miles on some of these players for the Celtics. I just don't know if I see it with the Cavs. Obviously, during the regular season, the highlight of this type of a matchup was the Dean Wade game where he came off the bench and went berserk. Wade is dealing with an injury right now. If they get him back, maybe, I shudder a little bit more at the idea of it, but I'm going to go with the Celtics in 5 in this series. And then moving on to the Western Conference here, we have the Thunder and the Mavericks. Thunder are slight favorites in this series, according to DraftKings again, minus 115 favorites. The Thunder are minus 115. The Mavericks are minus 105, so very, very contested series in the eyes of Vegas for this. I think the keys are going to be whether or not the Mavericks can hold up from that same defensive perspective. They were incredible during the series against the Clippers, held them to just over 100 points per game. They took Harden and Paul George out of it for the most part, other than that Game 5 win, I believe it was, where it was just a super ugly first quarter. They ended up battling back. Paul George hit some super tough shots down the stretch of that game. But I think that the Clippers are a lot more flawed than the Thunder are, and obviously the Kawhi factor played a big role in what the Clippers actually did look like by the time that the postseason came around. But with the Thunder, I think that they are super deep, and I think that they can sort of have a number of different guys hurt you. Now, it's not necessarily the same level of isolation ball, because I don't know. I mean, Shea, I'm probably being disrespectful even saying that Shea isn't necessarily an ISO scorer. I don't view him that way in terms of being a ball stopper, but he can absolutely take just about anybody off the dribble himself. So, it's going to be interesting to see who's going to be that point of attack defender for Dallas. We also have the fact that Maxi Kleber, like I mentioned earlier in the show, he is going to be out indefinitely with that separated shoulder. I think that is a big time deal, because you look at the Thunder, who are one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the NBA. Kleber provided a level of spacing that was massive for them. Now, I don't know if necessarily the Mavericks were going to be able to run that double big lineup quite as much as they were against the Clippers because of spacing purposes on the defensive end and having some of these big men maybe get out on the perimeter a little bit more. But still, I feel like what I've liked about the Mavericks so much is the fact that they are able to throw out all of these different looks, and they can play big when they want to. They can play small a little bit when they put Kleber at the 5, and I feel like some of those bench minutes when Chet Holmgren isn't on the court, I thought that was maybe going to be an option for them to run, and we saw them close out some of the early games with Kleber at the 5, and it was working for them. So I thought that was going to be a little bit more of the route that they go with, but this is definitely a big loss for them, and I do think plays a big time role in this. Going to be super curious to see how this all plays out. I think it should be a really good series. Obviously, Vegas does too. This is also going to be a game that definitely, the whole idea of playoff experience and how valuable is that is going to come into conversation, because of the fact that everybody thought that this was a year too early for the Thunder, that they weren't necessarily going to be ready, and they end up steamrolling the Pelicans. Now, that being said, Pelicans obviously without Zion Williamson, I think he plays that series that is definitely more competitive, but this is a Thunder team that has showed us they were great all season long, and yet they have still had their share of doubters in this postseason. Shannon Sharp called them the worst 1 seed ever, which I feel like he's got to be regretting a little bit up to this point. But, you know, I'm really excited for this series. Again, a fully bought in Kyrie Irving is something that I absolutely want to watch. Also, what is Luka Doncic going to look like? The Thunder are one of the more underrated defenses in the league. I think that this could be, I don't want to say a defensive chess match, but I feel like both of these teams could end up having to rely on a level of difficult shots, which both Shea and Luka Doncic, throw Kyrie in there as well. They're both definitely capable of making, but the Thunder were a top 5 defense for most of the year. Post All-Star break, specifically in April, we saw the Dallas Mavericks with the 6th best defensive rating in the NBA. So both teams can play two-way. I think we're going to have some awesome individual moments with some of these players where Shea, Luka, Kyrie, any one of them is capable of putting together a highlight reel moment at any given time. So it should be really exciting to see. I do have the Thunder in 6 in this one. I think that, again, the level of depth, the level of shooting, and just, efficiency, the Mavericks have been very much leaning on that defense, which is great, but they were playing a Clippers team that wasn't necessarily, a well-oiled machine offensively towards the end of the year. Now, the Thunder also beat up on an undermanned Pelicans team, so I definitely don't want to make it seem like I'm just basing this off of the first round series, but I think that the Thunder are just the more talented team as a whole. Now, the Mavericks have the best player in the series. Is he going to show up? Because, again, it's not that Luka was bad necessarily, but efficiency numbers definitely weren't there for him the way that they would have wanted. Shot 41, 24 shooting splits, and he's just flat out going to need to be better if they're going to have a chance in this one. I don't know if the Mavericks necessarily have the size to take advantage of the Thunder in this series. Now, Thunder, another team that can definitely struggle with rebounding. We see some of these second efforts from Lively and Gafford. That is going to be another sort of key thing to watch as well. But I'm going to go with the Thunder in 6. Let me know what your thoughts on this series are. But that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on weekdays, so definitely be sure to check us out tomorrow. Follow us on social media for more exclusive short content as well. But thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.